Dawn crawls over the Ardennes like a reluctant promise. It is December 1944. The woods around a small Belgian market town called Bastogne are locked in ice. Trees stand rigid under the weight of snow, their branches black against a low, iron sky. Breath hangs in the air like smoke. From the east, figures move through the forest in white camouflage smocks. German infantry. Their boots crunch softly on the frozen ground, rifles held close against the cold. Somewhere behind them, the deeper rumble of tanks filters through the trees. Officers murmur familiar reassurances. The Americans are soft. They hate the cold. They break when surprised. This pocket will fall quickly. But at the edge of Bastogne, another army is already in the ground. Paratroopers of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division stamp numb feet in shallow foxholes. Many wear thin summer uniforms beneath mismatched scarves and blankets. Their helmets are rimmed with frost. Artillery rumbles closer, and the distant thud of German guns echoes through the timberline. Surrounded, short of food, fuel, and ammunition, these men have no intention of running. Because here, in the snow around Bastogne, the German idea of a cowardly American is about to be tested. By the late autumn of 1944, it seemed to many on the Western Front that the war in Europe was entering its final act. The German army had been driven out of France. Paris was liberated in August. Allied armies had rolled east in a broad front, their armored columns moving through shattered villages and over burned-out crossroads, chasing a retreating enemy back to its own borders. In the mess tents and foxholes of American units, one phrase had begun to circulate with a kind of hopeful stubbornness: home by Christmas. Yet behind that optimism lay a tougher reality. In September, an audacious Allied plan called Operation Market Garden had attempted to leap across the Rhine in the Netherlands using airborne troops and a thrust of British armor. It failed. The bridges at Arnhem were not taken in time. The attack bogged down under fierce German resistance. Casualties among elite airborne divisions, including the 101st, were heavy. The war did not end quickly. By October and November, the Allied advance slowed to a crawl. Long supply lines from the ports on the Atlantic and Channel coasts strained under the weight of an army that consumed food, fuel, and ammunition in industrial quantities. Fuel shortages delayed operations. Autumn rains turned roads into quagmires. The front stabilized roughly along Germany's western borders. There, a dark band of hills and forest known as the Ardennes cut across the maps of planners at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force. To the Americans, it was an unpromising sector for offensive action. Thick woods, narrow roads, low ridgelines. A quiet front, suitable for resting tired divisions and breaking in inexperienced ones. On the other side of that line, the calculations looked very different. Inside Germany, defeat had become a looming shadow. The Wehrmacht had been pushed back on every front. In the east, the Red Army stood deep inside Poland and the Baltic states. In the west, American, British, and Canadian armies pressed against the Siegfried Line. Strategic bombing shattered cities and factories. Fuel was desperately short. The Reich's industrial and manpower reserves were nearly exhausted. Yet Adolf Hitler, ensconced in his headquarters, refused to accept a defensive mindset. To him, only a bold stroke could change the course of the war. During September and October, he fixed on an idea that many of his senior generals considered reckless: a massive counteroffensive in the west, through the Ardennes, aimed not at pushing the Allies back a few miles, but at splitting their armies in two. The plan was codenamed Unternehmen Wacht am Rhein, Operation Watch on the Rhine. Its objective went far beyond the forested hills on the border. German armored spearheads would punch through the thinly held American lines in the Ardennes, capture key road junctions like Saint-Vith and Bastogne, then drive all the way to the Meuse River in Belgium. If they could seize crossings there and push further to Antwerp, they might cut off British and American forces in the north from those in the south, forcing a crisis in Allied command and perhaps even a negotiated peace in the west. The risks were immense. German armored divisions had been gutted over the past year. Fuel stocks were barely sufficient for a single major operation. The Luftwaffe was a shadow of what it had been. But in Hitler's mind, the very boldness of the gamble would compensate for these weaknesses. Surprise would be his greatest weapon. For surprise, he needed secrecy. In the wooded Eifel region east of the Ardennes, German staff officers bent over maps late into the night. Field marshals like Gerd von Rundstedt nominally oversaw the operation, while General Walter Model and commanders such as Hasso von Manteuffel and Sepp Dietrich refined the plans for their armies. Panzer divisions were rebuilt on paper, units shifted by night, radio traffic kept to a minimum. New Volksgrenadier divisions, some filled with older men and hastily trained recruits, were slotted into the attack order beside battle-hardened veterans. Allied intelligence noticed some of this movement but misread its meaning. The Ardennes had been quiet for months. The terrain seemed ill-suited to large-scale armor operations. The Germans, they believed, lacked the resources for a major offensive. At SHAEF, analysts assumed that any winter German action would be local, perhaps a spoiling attack, not a decisive thrust. Along the front, this strategic misjudgment translated into deployments. In the Ardennes sector, U.S. First Army under Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges placed some of its least experienced or most worn-down divisions. The 106th Infantry Division, new to combat, took over positions along the Schnee-Eifel. The battered 28th Infantry Division, roughly handled in the Huichen Forest, was sent to the Ardennes to rest and refit while still holding a stretch of line. Supporting units were thin. Artillery was adequate but not heavy. Tank units were scattered. To many American soldiers, the wooded hills they now trudged through felt like a backwater. They complained about the cold more than the enemy. Patrols probed into the trees and came back reporting occasional skirmishes, scattered contacts, but nothing major. In letters home, men mentioned muddy roads, the quiet of the snow-covered forests, the sense that this was a place to catch one's breath. Far to the rear, in camps around Reims and Mermelin in France, the 101st Airborne Division was trying to do just that. After the hard fighting in Normandy and Holland, the Screaming Eagles were refitting, absorbing replacements, cleaning weapons, and for the first time in months sleeping on mattresses under roofs. Some had managed to find showers. Others went into nearby towns, seeking a few hours in cafes, cinemas, or bars before the next assignment. They did not know that their respite would be cut short. In Berlin, propaganda continued to hammer an image of the American soldier, poorly led, overdependent on machines, unwilling to fight without overwhelming superiority, lacking the iron will of the German lancer. Many German officers, shaped by early victories and by ideological contempt, believed variations of this. In winter, they told each other such an army would be even weaker. On the night of 15 December 1944, along a 130-kilometer stretch of front facing the Ardennes, German assault troops moved quietly into their start positions, sheltered in woods and hollows, waiting for the signal. Before dawn the next morning, the quiet front would explode. At 05:30 on 16 December 1944, the darkness in the Ardennes shattered. From hidden positions along the German side of the line, more than 1,000 guns and rocket launchers opened fire almost at once. The night lit up in pulses of orange. Trees cracked and splintered under the concussions. American positions from the Schnee-Eifel south toward Luxembourg were hit by shells that churned up earth and snow, shredded wire, smashed bunkers, and severed telephone lines in an instant. In the forward foxholes of USV and VIII Corps, men were jolted awake by explosions that seemed to come from every direction. Radios crackled, then fell silent as antennas were smashed. In some sectors, stunned infantry never saw the German assault troops until they were already in the wire. As the barrage lifted, gray figures materialized out of the forests and ravines. Volksgrenadiers in winter coats, assault engineers with flamethrowers and explosives, followed by tanks and self-propelled guns edging along the narrow, icy roads. They pushed into the American line at multiple points, aiming to rip it open before the defenders could understand what was happening. Fog and low cloud wrapped the battlefield. Allied aircraft, usually a constant threat to German movement by day, were grounded. The sky was a dull lid that hid the buildup of columns on the roads behind the front. Some American units fought hard, buying time in desperate small-unit engagements. Others, especially those hit hardest and earliest, fell back in confusion or were overrun. The 106th Infantry Division, green and spread thin along the Schnee-Eifel, found two of its regiments isolated and eventually encircled. South of them, elements of the 28th Division were hammered out of their positions and forced into chaotic withdrawal along clogged, icy roads. As the hours passed, reports filtered back to higher headquarters. Enemy armor sighted where none had been expected, entire regiments out of contact, towns lost or in flames. Maps at First Army and at SHAEF, once showing a mostly straight line, began to bulge westward as German penetrations deepened. That distortion on paper would soon become known as the bulge. To the German high command, however, the map had one central obstacle, a small town called Bastogne. Bastogne was not large. Before the war, it had been a modest Belgian market town, but it sat at the hub of a vital road network. 7 major roads radiated outward from its center like spokes. In terrain where forests and hills funneled movement, whoever held Bastogne controlled the flow of traffic through a broad swath of the Ardennes. For the German 5th Panzer Army under General Hasso von Manteuffel, Bastogne was a crucial objective. His armored divisions, including Panzer Lehr and the 2nd Panzer Division, would need those roads to move rapidly west toward the Meuse. Alongside them, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and other infantry formations would help in seizing and holding the town. The first clashes around Bastogne were chaotic. As the offensive broke on 16 December, the American VIII Corps rear areas awoke to a stream of vehicles heading west, jeeps, trucks, half-tracks and ambulances carrying wounded, mixed with dazed stragglers on foot. Traffic jams formed in villages and at crossroads as military policemen struggled to impose order. In Bastogne itself, the U.S. 28th Infantry Division maintained headquarters elements and support units. Tankers of the 10th Armored Division were also in the region, some detached into combat commands sent forward piecemeal to stem the oncoming tide. Hastily assembled roadblocks, small tank infantry teams and engineer detachments deployed along approaches to the town, trying to slow the German advance. But it was soon clear that something far larger than a local attack was underway. On 17 December, as reports of a massive German offensive accumulated, General Dwight D. Eisenhower and his senior commanders gathered at a headquarters in Verdun. There, under maps pinned to cold stone walls, they digested what their staffs could confirm. Enemy armor was driving in strength across a broad front, communications were patchy, the weather prevented meaningful air reconnaissance. Eisenhower made a decision that would define the battle. The German blow had landed in what Allied plans considered a quiet sector, but it had also struck near the seam between British and American armies. To plug the gap and halt the advance, Eisenhower ordered his only available operational reserve, 2 airborne divisions then refitting after Holland, to move at once. The veteran 82nd Airborne Division would deploy to the north, near the threatened junction at Saint-Vith. The 101st Airborne Division would go to Bastogne. At Mermelin, men of the 101st were roused in the middle of the night. They were told to pack quickly. Many had not yet received proper winter clothing. Some were pulled from passes in nearby towns and hurried back to camp. Trucks arrived in rows, engines idling in the cold air, their sides stenciled with white stars. Paratroopers who had expected weeks of recovery now slung their M1 rifles and machine guns once more, loading up ammunition, blankets, and whatever extra clothing they could scrounge. They climbed into open-bed trucks, crowding together against the wind. The column that formed would stretch for miles along the dark French roads. The journey toward Bastogne was miserable. Snow flurries swept across the columns. Men wrapped scarves and blankets around their faces against the freezing air. The truck convoys passed westbound refugees and scattered American vehicles withdrawing from the front. Occasionally they rolled past burned-out hulks and fresh shell craters, reminders that the safe rear they were leaving had moved east with them. On 18 and 19 December, the lead elements of the 101st began to arrive in and around Bastogne. They were joined by Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division and various artillery, engineer, and support units diverted into the area. The town's narrow streets were soon choked with military vehicles, artillery limbers, and marching columns. What the paratroopers saw was not the ordered battlefield of a campaign plan, but a landscape in flux. Wounded were being evacuated through the same roads they were using to come in. Local civilians watched from doorways and cellar stairs as new troops arrived under gray skis. Military police waved traffic through intersections, shouting above the noise of engines and the distant thud of German artillery edging closer. Officers of the 101st met hurriedly with VIII Corps staff and local commanders. The orders were direct: Bastogne was to be held. The town and its road network could not be allowed to fall into German hands. The paratroopers were to move out at once to establish a defensive ring around the town, occupying villages, woods, and ridgelines in all directions. They left Bastogne in scattered groups, marching into the frozen countryside as daylight faded. Men dug in on hills they could barely see the outlines of, marking positions on hastily sketched maps. Few yet realized that within days the roles would reverse, that they, not the Germans, would be the ones surrounded. They took their places in the snow under a low winter sky, while to the east German columns rolled forward with the confidence of an army certain its enemy would not stand. For many of the German soldiers moving through the snowy forests toward Bastogne, the enemy they expected to meet existed more in rumor and ideology than in reality. Years of propaganda had etched a picture of the American fighting man, spoiled by wealth, soft from comfort, lacking the iron discipline of the German lancer. Posters and newsreels in the Reich depicted the United States as a land of jazz, factories, and racial mixing, not of hardened infantry. Officers repeated familiar judgments. Americans could fight only with overwhelming artillery and air support. Without tanks and aircraft, their will would crumble. Early encounters in North Africa and Italy, where inexperienced U.S. units had sometimes broken under surprise, were remembered and generalized. By December 1944, some of those notions had already been challenged at Salerno, Anzio, Normandy. Yet they persisted, especially among younger soldiers raised in a closed information world. Many believed that this winter offensive would catch a complacent, overextended enemy unprepared and unwilling to endure hardship. The Ardennes seemed to favor that belief. Snow, ice, and bitter wind conditions. German officers argued that their own troops, seasoned by years on the Eastern Front, could withstand better than men from Ohio or Texas. Around campfires and in briefing rooms, they told each other that one sharp blow would shatter this multinational, materialistic coalition. As they advanced toward the road hub at Bastogne, German units anticipated a confused defense at most, re-echelon troops, scattered stragglers, perhaps panicked withdrawals. Few imagined that the junction town would be held by an American division that did not fit the caricature at all. The paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division had grown up under a different story. Born in 1942 amid the experiment of American airborne forces, the division recruited volunteers who accepted a higher standard from the start. They endured jump school at Fort Benning, Georgia, tough physical conditioning, tower jumps, live-fire exercises, and were told that failure was not an option. The silver wings on their chests, the screaming eagle patch on their shoulders were not issued lightly. By the time their trucks rolled into Bastogne, these men carried more than equipment and rifles. They carried memory. Of June 6, 1944, when they had dropped over Normandy in the dark, scattered by flak and wind, forming ad hoc groups in hedgerows and orchards to seize causeways and villages. Of fighting through the Bocage and into Carentan. Of Holland in September, the long march on Hell's Highway, the bridges along the Maas and the Val, the bitter lesson of a bridge too far at Arnhem. They had seen friends killed and replacements folded into their ranks. Their officers and NCOs had been tempered by successive campaigns. Commanders like Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, now acting division commander in place of Maxwell Taylor, had learned to trust small unit initiative. Regimental leaders, the kind who walked the line in worn jump jackets, understood what their paratroopers could endure. There was pride, too. Airborne units considered themselves elite. They teased and sometimes looked down on standard infantry, but that pride was tied to an expectation. They would be sent where the fighting was hardest and they would not break. In the frozen approaches to Bastogne, that identity mattered. Men huddling in shallow foxholes, their feet already numbing, knew that turning and running would not only risk death, it would betray what they believed themselves to be. Where German soldiers had been told they faced cowards, the 101st's men had been told, by training and experience, that they were the ones others would rely on when everything else was failing. That belief would be tested at every tree line and crossroads around Bastogne. The land itself was an uncredited actor in what followed. The Ardennes was not the kind of terrain that generals liked to mark with sweeping arrows on a map. It was a region of rolling hills, densely wooded ridges, narrow valleys, and scattered farming villages. In summer, its forests were green and close, the roads twisting and hemmed in by trees. In winter, under ice and snow, those same roads became treacherous ribbons of frozen mud. Bastogne sat on a plateau amid this broken ground. From the town, 7 hard-surfaced roads radiated outward to Houffalize, Novel, Foy, Neufchâteau, and other points that dotted the staff maps of both sides. Smaller country lanes connected farms and hamlets, but heavy vehicles depended on those main routes. To move tanks and supply columns across the Ardennes at speed, you needed nodes like Bastogne. For a defender, that same reality offered opportunity. Hold the junction, and you could force an attacker to detour onto poor secondary roads, slowing his timetable and exposing his flanks to counterattack. Even surrounded, garrisoning a central hub allowed a force to support all sides of its perimeter with artillery and maneuver. The weather sharpened the blade. December 1944 in the Ardennes was brutally cold. Temperatures often hovered below freezing. Moisture from men's breath crystallized on scarves and collars. Weapons jammed if not carefully cleaned, lubricants thickened. Snow muffled movement but revealed tracks, complicating both patrols and deception. For soldiers without proper winter clothing, frostbite became as real a threat as bullets. For the 101st and the attached units gathering around Bastogne, the landscape was both shield and trap. Woods and folds in the ground offered cover for defensive positions and ambushes. But those same features could harbor infiltrating enemy patrols, and the limited road net meant that if the Germans cut the spokes, the town at the center would be isolated. As American companies dug into frozen soil on ridges, in tree lines, and along village streets, they were not only arranging a tactical defense. They were anchoring themselves in a piece of ground that both sides understood. Whoever held Bastogne would shape the fate of the Ardennes offensive. Yet terrain and mindset were only part of the story. Around Bastogne, other factors, supplies, civilians, the closed sky overhead, would help decide whether the town could endure a siege. When the 101st Airborne rolled into Bastogne, they did not bring the kind of stocks one would expect for a protracted siege. They had been rushed from rest camps, told they were plugging a hole, not sitting out an encirclement. As regiments spread into the countryside, their actual reserves of ammunition, food, fuel, and medical supplies were limited. Artillery units towed their howitzers into position with only a few days' worth of shells. Rifle companies carried what they could on their backs and in jeeps. Almost at once, the gap between need and reality became obvious. The tempo of German probes and attacks around the growing perimeter demanded heavy artillery fire. Each barrage that broke up a tank column or scattered an infantry assault consumed precious rounds. Battery commanders and division artillery staff began to ration fire. Fewer registration shots, tighter control of missions, constant calculations of what might be needed if things got worse. Rations were another quiet battlefield. The standard K rations and C rations on hand were never intended for a long stand under siege. As the days passed, meals were reduced, then reduced again. Men fought in the cold on half rations or less, sharing chocolate bars, stretching coffee, boiling whatever could be heated over makeshift stoves. In aid stations set up in cellars, churches, and schoolhouses, the medical picture was grim. The wounded from outlying fights were brought in on jeeps, sleds, or on the shoulders of comrades. Morphine was scarce. Bandages ran out, sheets and shirts were torn into strips. Surgeons worked by lantern light, their breath clouding in the freezing air, improvising with what little they had. Vehicles ran low on fuel. Some tanks and half-tracks were cannibalized, drained dry to keep others running. Every shell fired, every gallon burned was a calculation against an uncertain future. Bastogne could be held only as long as the defenders' material will matched their human one. Around them, in cellars and basements, an older civilian life was shrinking under the pressure of war. Before the shells fell, Bastogne was a place of markets and quiet streets. Its people had already endured occupation once. In 1940, the town had fallen under German control. 4 years later, American troops liberated it. There had been a sense of cautious relief, of life edging back toward normal. Shops reopened, schools functioned, church bells rang without fear that a German officer might intervene. When the American trucks and tanks came back in December 1944, many residents watched with a complicated mix of trust and dread. Some remembered what it meant for the front to pass through. Others believed or hoped that the fighting might stay at a distance. It did not. As German artillery crept closer, civilians moved underground. Families crowded into basements, bringing what food, blankets, and valuables they could carry. In the St. Pierre Church, people huddled under stone vaults as blasts shook dust from the rafters. Children cried or stared silently as medics brought in wounded soldiers to lay beside them. Interactions between townsfolk and American troops were varied but intensely human. Belgian families shared cellars with paratroopers, offering coffee, bread, or a corner of floor. Some served as guides, pointing out back roads and footpaths through the woods. Others looked on with quiet resentment as their town again became a target, its homes transformed into billets, aid posts, or command centers. The fighting blurred lines. In some houses, American machine guns fired from upstairs windows while civilians cowered below. Shells did not distinguish between uniforms and civilian clothes. When buildings collapsed, rescuers clawed through rubble for anyone, soldier or townsman, still alive. Yet the presence of the town, of real streets, churches, and families, shaped the defenders' will in ways that empty ground might not have. Holding Bastogne was not just about a dot on a map, it was about protecting the people who now shared their cellars and their fear. Above them all for days, the sky offered no relief. In earlier campaigns, American units had grown used to a certain rhythm. If you could hold through the night, daylight might bring aircraft. Fighter bombers could smash enemy columns, strafe supply lines, relieve pressure. Transport planes could drop supplies to units cut off on the ground. In the opening days around Bastogne, that rhythm was broken. The Ardennes lay under a lid of cloud and fog. Snow squalls drifted through the forests. Visibility was poor, ceilings low. Runways back in England and France were covered in ice and snow. Even when aircraft could take off, finding specific drop zones or targets under such conditions was uncertain at best. For the Germans, this was a calculated advantage. The offensive had been timed in part for the winter weather to negate Allied air superiority. Armored columns could move by day without constant fear of roving thunderbolts and typhoons. Supply convoys wound through the forest roads, shielded as much by the sky as by the trees. Inside Bastogne, the same sky felt like a sealed door. Men looked up from foxholes and courtyard positions and saw only gray. They listened for the distant thrum of engines that might signal resupply but heard only artillery and the closer sounds of small arms. Rumors circulated, planes had tried to get through. A drop was planned, no one knew when. Allied staff were, in fact, planning air missions. C-47 transport planes were readied, parachutes packed, bundles marked. Fighter bomber groups waited for clearance. But until the weather changed, these preparations remained lines on a board, not lifelines over Bastogne. The psychological weight of that closed sky was heavy. The encircling German forces could move and mass largely unseen. The town's defenders burned through ammunition and bandages without visible replenishment. Each day the clouds held, the siege tightened by another notch. When the shift finally came, when the clouds began to thin and blue patches appeared above the white fields, the effect would be as much emotional as physical. But before that, the ring had to close fully, and the men in and around Bastogne had to face the reality that the quiet front had become a trap. As German divisions swung around the town and the last roads west were cut, the stage was set for the struggle that would define Bastogne in history. The noose drew tight almost without anyone marking the exact moment. In the days after the 101st Airborne arrived, American units flowed through Bastogne and then fanned out, taking up positions in villages and on ridges that ringed the town. Elements of the 10th Armored Division, especially Combat Command B, pushed forward to key road junctions to delay the enemy. Small groups of Shermans and tank destroyers, backed by infantry and engineers, attempting to buy hours with their lives. To the northeast, at a village called Novel, a combined force of paratroopers from the 506th Parachute Infantry and tanks from the 10th Armored dug in amid stone houses and barns. Snow lay in ridges along the streets, churned by tracks and boots. On 19 December, German armor pushed in hard. The fight that followed was sharp and savage, tanks trading rounds at close range, infantry knotting through gardens and alleys. Novel could not be held indefinitely. Under heavy pressure and taking casualties, the defenders withdrew, fighting their way back toward Foy and the high ground closer to Bastogne. Similar scenes unfolded around the compass. East of the town, American positions around Neuf, Bizery, and Mont met advancing infantry and panzers with mines, anti-tank guns, and stubborn small arms fire. Southward near Marvy and along the road to Neufchâteau, tank infantry teams tried to blunt probing attacks. To the west, at places like Champs and Hemerel, thin lines of riflemen and machine gunners felt for the leading edges of German thrusts. By 2021 December, German spearheads had looped around Bastogne from north and south. Roads leading west were cut by advancing units of Panzerlehr and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. What had been a forward assembly area for American forces became, almost overnight, a pocket. Inside that pocket, a disparate garrison pulled tighter together. The Corps was the 101st Airborne Division, 3 parachute infantry regiments and a glider infantry regiment, backed by divisional artillery and support units. Around them were gathered the tanks and armored infantry of Combat Command B, 10th Armored Division, battalions of engineers, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, artillery groups including the 420th and others, remnants of the 28th Infantry Division and 9th Armored Division. Clerks, drivers, and cooks hastily issued rifles and sent to hold roadblocks. In all, perhaps 18,000 Americans were now inside the ring. They established a perimeter of foxholes, gun pits, and roadblocks that ran in a rough circle several kilometers from the town center. Each sector had its own crisis points. In the woods and fields, the siege took on a particular rhythm. German artillery would search out crossroads and suspected gun positions. Patrols from both sides probed the dark tree lines, sometimes colliding at close range in brief, violent skirmishes. When heavier attacks came, they arrived with the grinding of tank tracks and the shouted commands of infantry pushing through snow. American artillery, massed inside the pocket, became the great equalizer. Even with limited ammunition, fire direction centers coordinated multiple battalions onto single targets. When German groups broke cover, columns bunching up on a road, infantry forming for an assault, the defenders called for fire. High-explosive shells walked across fields and along forest edges, tearing gaps in advancing lines. For the Germans, the encirclement brought a new tactical problem. Bastogne had not collapsed as expected. Instead of scattered resistance, they faced a coherent, if improvised, fortress. The town's road network remained in enemy hands, its guns still reaching out in all directions to disrupt their timetable toward the Meuse. By 22 December, German command around Bastogne, under General Heinrich von Leutwitz of XLVII Panzer Corps, decided on a different instrument, not shells but paper. That morning, under a white flag, a small German delegation approached the American lines east of the town. Blindfolded, they were taken through to headquarters in Bastogne. They carried a typed message demanding the honorable surrender of the encircled U.S. forces, warning that if the offer was refused, the town would face annihilation by artillery. The note made its way to Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, acting commander of the 101st. He read it amid the clutter of a besieged headquarters, maps, radio sets, dispatch riders coming and going. Officers around him considered the implications. The situation was serious. Ammunition was finite, medical facilities strained, the enemy numerous. McAuliffe's written reply would become one of the most famous single-word messages of the war. Typed, signed, and handed back to the German envoys, it expressed in plain language what the men in the foxholes already felt. There would be no surrender. When the German delegation returned to their own lines and the translation was passed up the chain, reactions ranged from disbelief to anger. Some saw it as bravado. Others began to adjust their understanding of the defenders' resolve. On maps in Corps and Army headquarters, the circle around Bastogne remained unbroken. Denied a bloodless victory, German forces tightened their grip. Attacks increased along the perimeter. In the villages that formed anchor points of the defense, Foy to the north, Marvy to the south, Champs and Hemerel to the west, American platoons and companies found themselves facing repeated assaults by infantry backed with armor and self-propelled guns. At night, flares arced into the sky, painting snow and ruins in harsh, colorless light. Inside the town, shells fell more frequently. Buildings burned or collapsed. Civilians and wounded soldiers shared crowded cellars, listening to the steady crump of impacts and the whistle of incoming rounds. Medics worked without rest. Supply officers inventoried dwindling stocks again and again, searching for some overlooked cache of ammunition or rations. On the German side, pressure mounted as well. The offensive timetable was slipping. Fuel shortages grew more acute. Commanders who had expected to use Bastogne's roads for their own advance were now forced to detour, losing precious days. The decision was made. Bastogne would have to be crushed by force, its defenders overwhelmed in a series of coordinated blows. The heaviest assaults were still to come, aimed at cracking the ring before weather and Allied countermeasures could change the balance. In the gray light of the next mornings, the siege became a series of hammer blows. On 23 December, German commanders around Bastogne committed more troops to crush the pocket. Infantry of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, supported by armor and self-propelled guns, pressed hardest on the northeastern arc of the perimeter, toward villages like Neff and Bizery, where the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment and other elements of the 101st held the line. Snow-covered fields and patches of woods became killing grounds. German troops formed up at the edges of forests, then pushed out across open ground, their dark figures stark against the white. American observers watched from church towers, barns, and treetops, calling in fire. Artillery from multiple battalions, 105 mm and 155 howitzers hidden in orchards and behind hedgerows, lashed the attacking formations. Shells lifted plumes of snow and earth, shredding ranks, setting vehicles alight. The 463rd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion and others fired until barrels steamed and crews' exposed skin stuck briefly to cold steel. When some German elements pushed through the barrages and reached the forward foxholes, the fighting devolved into close-range fire with rifles, bars, and grenades around shattered farmsteads and frozen ditches. That same day, something changed overhead. By late morning on the 23rd, the iron lid of cloud that had hung over the Ardennes began to crack. Patches of pale blue appeared. The ceiling lifted. At first, the men in the foxholes only noticed a different light on the snow, then they heard it, the distant growl of engines in the sky. C-47 transport aircraft from IX Troop Carrier Command, flying in long, vulnerable formations, began to appear over the Bastogne area. Their crews, guided by radio and by colored panels laid out on the snow below, kicked out bundles of supplies on parachutes, ammunition, medical kits, food, even some winter clothing. German anti-aircraft fire reached up from the forests and villages, claiming some of them, but many made it through. On the ground, paratroopers, engineers, and service troops sprinted across open fields under intermittent shell fire to retrieve the drops. Some parachutes had drifted beyond the American lines and into German-held areas, a bitter sight, seeing the supplies they so desperately needed land beyond reach. But enough fell inside the perimeter to ease the most acute shortages. Later, fighter-bombers joined the scene. Thunderbolts and other aircraft swept over German positions, bombing and strafing columns and assembly areas that had moved with near impunity in the days of low cloud. The sudden appearance of Allied aircraft was a shock to many German soldiers who had begun to believe that winter had given them the sky. For the men in Bastogne, the open heavens did not end the siege, but they shifted its balance. Artillery could fire a little more freely. Medical units received new morphine and bandages. Rations, though still short, were less desperate. Above all, the sense of isolation cracked. The Germans felt the pressure too. Their timetable was slipping, fuel drains deepening, yet they were not done with Bastogne. On 24 December, Christmas Eve, the main weight of the German assault fell along the southern edge of the pocket. In and around the village of Marvy, just a couple of kilometers from Bastogne, infantry of the 26th Volksgrenadier and elements of 15th Panzergrenadier Division, backed by tanks, slammed into the positions held by the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment and armored units of Combat Command B, 10th Armored Division. It was dusk when the attack gathered. Snow blurred the fields, small patches of forest broke the line of sight. German armor nosed forward using low ground and tree lines for cover. Artillery pounded American positions, outgoing fire answered from batteries behind Bastogne. When the panzers and infantry reached Marvy, fighting erupted in the streets and among the houses. Some German tanks broke into the village, their guns blasting through walls. Bazooka teams hunted them at close range, slipping between buildings, firing then ducking away. Tank destroyers from the 705th with their fast M18s moved into firing positions, knocking out panzers that silhouetted themselves against the glow of burning buildings. For a time, the outcome in Marvy hung in the balance, but the defenders held. Reinforcements from the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment and other units helped stabilize the line. By night's end, German forces had failed to tear open the southern flank. Shells fell on Bastogne through the evening. In cellars, men and women marked Christmas Eve amid explosions and dust. A few units held brief services, chaplains speaking quietly as the building trembled. Some paratroopers dug candles out of packs, lighting them in foxholes or dugouts for a moment of light against the winter darkness. There was no ceasefire, no shared carols across the lines, only the grinding continuation of war. The next morning, Christmas Day, the German command tried again, this time turning full weight against the western side of the ring. Before dawn, under low clouds and freezing wind, elements of Panzer Lehr Division and associated units formed up near the villages of Champs and Hemmerl. It was a bold attempt to punch through, using armor in strength. They advanced in darkness and half-light, tanks rolling forward with infantry in their wake. Against them stood paratroopers of the 502nd Parachute Infantry and glidermen of the 327th, dug into positions around the villages and in the open fields beyond. Snow lay deep. The silhouettes of attacking tanks emerged as dark masses against a faintly glowing horizon. As the German armor approached Champs, the Americans opened fire. Anti-tank guns, machine guns, and rifles raked the leading elements. Artillery observers called down concentrated fire on the forming waves, yet some panzers pushed through, skirting the village, seeking a gap. Near Hemmerl, a group of German tanks broke into more open ground. Behind low rises and in tree lines, American anti-tank teams and the M18 Hellcats of the 705th waited. When the silhouettes of the panzers crested into view, the defenders unleashed everything they had. In a chaotic engagement, tank destroyers and bazooka teams knocked out multiple German vehicles. Flames lit the snow, turning the fields into a scene of burning metal and black smoke. Paratroopers moved among knocked-out hulks, finishing off isolated infantry or taking prisoners. By mid-morning, the western thrust had spent its force. Dozens of German tanks littered the ground, their hoped-for breakthrough snuffed out. The defenders' Christmas had been marked not by calm but by some of the fiercest fighting of the siege, yet the ring still held. Beyond that ring, another force had been fighting its way north. Days earlier, at the Verdun Conference, Eisenhower had asked George Patton how quickly he could pivot his Third Army to strike toward the Ardennes. Patton had already been planning such a contingency. Orders went out. Entire corps swung 90 degrees, units turning their axis of advance in a maneuver that strained logistics, testing coordination and endurance. The 4th Armored Division under Major General Hugh Gaffey was chosen as the spearhead for the relief of Bastogne. Its combat commands, A, B, and Reserve fought their way through Luxembourg and into Belgium, encountering blown bridges, mined roads, and stiffening German resistance. Winter weather, so helpful to the original German offensive, now slowed the American counterthrust as well. On 23, 24, and 25 December, the 4th Armored's lead elements battled through towns and villages south of Bastogne. At places like Martelange and Chaumont, they fought ambushes, artillery fire, and counterattacks. Progress was measured in kilometers and casualties, but the advance did not stop. By 26 December, the leading battalion, 37th Tank Battalion under Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, working with armored infantry, closed on the southern approaches to Bastogne. German units, aware now that a relief attempt was underway, manned roadblocks and defensive positions in the woods and villages between the town and the oncoming armor. That afternoon, the final push began along the road through the small village of Assenois, southwest of Bastogne. Artillery pounded German positions ahead of the 4th Armored Column. Smoke rounds obscured some of the defenders' lines of sight. Tanks and infantry moved forward together, clearing resistance from ditches and tree lines. As the Shermans of the 37th nosed through the outskirts of Assenois, they ran into fire from anti-tank guns and infantry weapons. One was knocked out, others returned fire in short, brutal exchanges. Beyond the village lay open fields and woods leading toward the American lines. There, elements of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion and other units from the 101st were holding a southern sector of the perimeter, thinly stretched but still intact. As daylight faded on 26 December, the tanks pushed through. Snow was churned brown by tracks. The barrels of the Shermans steamed in the cold. Ahead of them, American artillery lifted its covering fire at prearranged times, opening a corridor. Then, between Assenois and Bastogne, the two forces met. For the men in the foxholes, the first sign was the rumble of engines from an unexpected direction. Then the shapes of American tanks appeared, their hulls recognizable even at a distance. Some accounts recall flares fired into the air, signaling recognition. Others describe handshakes and brief words amid the continuing shell fire. However remembered, the fact was clear. The encirclement of Bastogne had been broken. A narrow corridor now ran from the town southward to the rest of 3rd Army. Ambulances and jeeps immediately began to move along it, evacuating some of the worst wounded, bringing in more supplies. The siege in its strictest sense was over. Yet for those still along the perimeter, nothing felt simple or finished. German forces did not vanish, they pulled back only as far as necessary, still contesting ground, still firing artillery into Bastogne. The wider Battle of the Bulge raged on. The German drive to the Meuse had been blunted but not yet fully reversed. What had changed, unmistakably, was the perception on both sides. For the Germans who had fought around Bastogne, the idea of an American soldier who would not stand up to pressure had eroded in the face of bitter experience. Paratroopers and armored crews who had held in snow and fire, under hunger and encirclement, for days beyond what had been expected. For the Americans, Bastogne had become something more than a dot on a map. It was proof that they could not only attack with overwhelming force, but also endure when cut off and outnumbered. In the days that followed, those truths would shape the aftermath, as the Bulge peaked, then slowly collapsed under counterstrikes, cold, and attrition. When the tanks of the 4th Armored Division linked hands with the engineers and paratroopers south of Bastogne, nothing stopped, everything merely shifted. The first priority was not celebration, but movement. Along the narrow corridor hacked through German positions near Assenois, ambulances, jeeps, and trucks began to flow as soon as it was dark enough to conceal some of their motion. Wounded who had lain for days in overcrowded cellars and makeshift aid stations were loaded carefully, blankets wrapped tight against the cold, morphine doses checked and rechecked. Drivers navigated churned, icy roads under intermittent shell fire, headlights masked, engines laboring. Inside Bastogne, the sounds changed timbre. The distant thump of artillery remained sporadic but insistent. Yet alongside it came the more regular growl of incoming American vehicles, the clank of unloaded crates, the shouted orders of fresh officers stepping into a world that smelled of smoke, disinfectant, sweat, and cold earth. The town itself bore the marks of the week-long siege. Streets were filled with rubble, stone, timber, glass. Shell holes pitted the squares. Roofs gaped open to the winter sky. Many houses were burned out shells, their interiors exposed like broken teeth. Civilian bodies had been buried hastily in courtyards or churchyards when it had been possible. Others still lay under debris that no one had yet had time to clear. Exact numbers are difficult to fix, but estimates suggest that several hundred Belgian civilians were killed in the shelling and street fighting in and around Bastogne. Those who survived emerged cautiously from cellars and basements, blinking in the sudden light of open doors, stepping into streets where unfamiliar armored vehicles now stood nose to tail. Medical units expanded into any available space. Schoolrooms became surgical wards. Pews were pushed aside in churches to make room for stretchers. Newly arrived doctors and nurses from 3rd Army joined the exhausted medics of the 101st and attached units. Operations ran around the clock. Frostbite cases lay alongside shrapnel and bullet wounds. Men with trench foot shared blankets with those who had been dug from collapsed buildings. For the defenders, the cost of holding the ring had been high. Combat casualties among American units in the Bastogne sector, killed, wounded, and missing, ran into the several thousands during the period of heaviest fighting in December and early January. Entire companies had been reduced to platoons to squads. Some regiments could count more gaps than familiar faces when they stood down to reorganize. German losses were also severe, particularly in armor. The failed attacks on the western and southern sectors had left dozens of tanks and assault guns burning in the snow near places like Champs, Hemmerl, and Marvy. Infantry formations such as the 26th Volksgrenadier Division had taken heavy losses in repeated assaults against well-sighted positions under intense artillery fire. Yet despite the opening of the corridor, Bastogne did not immediately become a safe rear area. German artillery continued to range the town. Counterattacks probed at the tenuous link to 3rd Army. The 101st Airborne and attached units remained in their foxholes along the perimeter, still trading fire, still watching tree lines, while fresher troops moved up to take over some sectors. At higher levels of German command, the failure to take Bastogne in the opening days was now understood as more than a local frustration. The entire Ardennes offensive had been built around speed. Panzer divisions were supposed to break through, bypass strongpoints, and drive hard for the Meuse before Allied command could react, before reserves could be shifted, before air power returned in strength. Instead, precious days had been lost in and around Bastogne. Armored units diverted to reduce the pocket found themselves bogged down in costly village fighting and forest assaults. Reports from Corps and Army headquarters spoke reluctantly of stubborn American resistance and unexpectedly strong defense at the road junction. Generals who had once described the U.S. Army as tactically clumsy and brittle under pressure now had to explain why an improvised garrison had held out under encirclement, hunger, and cold. At the frontline level, German soldiers who had fought in the woods and villages around Bastogne carried away different stories than the ones they had been told. They had advanced through snow under dense artillery fire, seen American paratroopers and tank crews hold positions to the last workable gun, watched as counterattacks came even when the defenders were short of everything but resolve. For the Americans inside the pocket, the relief brought a complex mix of emotions: exhaustion, grief for dead comrades, and a quieter, less triumphant realization that they had survived something that easily could have gone the other way. Many had fought without fully grasping their place in the wider battle, focused instead on the next hedgerow, the next attack, the next night in a freezing foxhole. Now, as casualty lists lengthened and wreckage was cleared, the significance of what had been held, and at what cost, began to filter in from above. At Eisenhower's headquarters and in the map rooms of Bradley's 12th Army Group and Patton's 3rd Army, the conclusion was inescapable. The failure to capture Bastogne on schedule had not only cost the Germans men and machines, it had fatally disrupted their operational design in the West. How that disruption rippled outward into the collapse of the Bulge, the fatting of German offensive power, and the forging of Bastogne's place in memory would become clear in the weeks that followed. In the larger shape of the Ardennes battle, the defense of Bastogne became a fixed point around which other events turned. While the 101st and its companions were holding their frozen ring, German armored spearheads had continued west. The 2nd Panzer Division and Panzerlehr pushed toward the Meuse, forcing back scattered American units, seizing villages, and in some places reaching within a few kilometers of the river. Small advance groups even looked down on crossings they would never take. Their progress, however, no longer matched the plan that had been drawn up in warm staff rooms weeks before. Every day spent hammering at Bastogne was a day not spent pressing the advance. Every convoy diverted to bring artillery ammunition to the siege lines was fuel that did not go into the tanks. Columns that might have driven unmolested along Bastogne's paved roads instead found themselves funneled onto narrow, icy tracks where breakdowns and Allied air attacks took a mounting toll. By late December, as Patton's Third Army punched north and First Army stiffened its defenses to the north of the Bulge, the German salient had begun to lose momentum. The hoped-for rapid crossing of the Meuse never came. Tank units that might have been massed for a decisive thrust arrived late, depleted, or not at all. The recapture of key points like Saint-Vith and the gradual widening of the corridor to Bastogne sealed the pattern. What had begun as a surprise offensive now turned into a grinding battle of attrition that Germany could ill afford. Through the end of December and into January 1945, Allied forces pressed in from north and south. To the north, American units of First Army alongside British XXX Corps counterattacked into the shoulders of the Bulge. To the south, Patton's forces continued to expand their gains. Step by step, village by village, the protruding German lines were compressed. Snow and bitter cold did what they had always done, killed the unwary, immobilized the careless, punished movement. But this time, the weather's advantage shifted. Clearer skies allowed Allied aircraft to resume systematic attacks. P-47s and Typhoons hunted columns, bombed road junctions, and harassed any attempt to shift reserves. By mid-January, German forces in the Ardennes were in retreat, pulling back toward their starting positions. The salient on the map shrank, then vanished. What remained was a line closer to Germany and armies that had bled away irreplaceable strength. In manpower and materiel, the Battle of the Bulge was a catastrophe for Hitler's war in the West. Exact tallies vary, but German losses are often estimated at between 80,000 and 100,000 men killed, wounded, or missing during the offensive, along with hundreds of tanks and assault guns. The panzer divisions that had spearheaded the attack emerged hollowed out. Fuel stocks already critical were spent in a failed gamble. These losses could not be made good. American casualties in the Ardennes were also severe. Roughly 19,000 killed and many tens of thousands wounded or captured across the broader battle. The fighting in and around Bastogne formed a significant, if smaller, part of that overall cost. Units that had entered the forest at full strength limped out weeks later, their rosters marked by gaps and hastily promoted replacements. Yet in psychological terms, the balance was different. For the German army, the failure of the Ardennes offensive, and with it, the failure to break Bastogne, signaled the end of any realistic hope of regaining the strategic initiative in the West. In officers' messes and dugouts, talk of victory gave way even among the loyal to talk of holding on as long as possible. Post-war memoirs by generals who had taken part in the operation often returned to Bastogne as a key frustration, a thorn that disrupted timing and bled offensive strength. For American forces, the perception of their own army shifted in a quieter way. Earlier in the war, the U.S. Army had been seen by allies and enemies alike as powerful but unproven, relying on numbers and industry more than endurance. The winter of 1944-45 showed something else. Green units could be shattered, but veterans could hold in conditions that tested any army. Bastogne became the clearest symbol of that endurance. News of the siege and relief filtered back to the home front in the weeks after Christmas. Newspaper stories and radio broadcasts spoke of paratroopers surrounded in snow, of tanks breaking through to a besieged town. The nuts! Reply, once decrypted from dry communiques, took on a life of its own, retold and embellished but rooted in a real, terse refusal to yield. Within the army, reputations were forged. The 101st Airborne Division, already respected for Normandy and Holland, acquired an aura around the phrase Bastogne. Years later, veterans would correct those who described them as having been rescued there, pointing out that they had fought continuously before and after the corridor opened. Officially, they received a Presidential Unit Citation for their stand, a rare honor for a whole division. For Patton and his Third Army, the rapid pivot and drive to relieve the town reinforced his image as an aggressive, mobile commander, capable of seizing opportunity in crisis. For Allied High Command, the episode underscored the value of airborne and armored units as flexible reserves, able to be hurled into an unexpected firestorm and hold until the wider machine could adjust. On the German side, frontline soldiers who had gone into the Ardennes expecting an easy test of American resolve emerged with a hardened respect for their opponents. Accounts spoke of well-led infantry that would not give ground easily, of artillery that answered swiftly and accurately, of an enemy who, once blooded, proved adaptable and tenacious. The myth of the soft, cowardly American, already fraying in Italy and France, tore open in the frozen fields around Bastogne. Long after the front moved east, the town remained scarred. Ruined buildings were rebuilt slowly. Graves were tended. Veterans returned in later years, walking the streets they had once sprinted across under shellfire, standing in fields where hedgerows had hidden gun pits and where wrecked tanks had burned against the snow. For them, the map symbols and unit designations resolved back into specific, enduring images. The weight of a frozen rifle, the sound of a distant tank track at night, the sight of a Belgian family huddled in a cellar as dust drifted from the ceiling. On larger maps, Bastogne was just one point in a vast war, but in December 1944 it had been a fulcrum, an unexpected test of character for both attacker and defender. What that test revealed about courage, miscalculation, and endurance would echo far beyond the Ardennes. In the end, Bastogne is less about a town than about an idea meeting reality. On paper, the Ardennes offensive promised much. It relied on surprise, on weather, on boldness, but also on an assumption that the American army filled with citizen soldiers would not endure a winter siege with the same grim resolve as their German counterparts. That assumption had roots in ideology, in early war experience, and in the comforting stories armies tell themselves about their enemies. In the snow around Bastogne, those stories were confronted by men in foxholes. The paratrooper in a thin jacket firing at shapes on a white field, the tank crewman coaxing one more hour from a frozen engine, the medic cutting bandages from bedsheets in a dark cellar, the Belgian mother passing a crust of bread to a shivering stranger in uniform, none of them matched the stereotype painted in propaganda halls far behind the lines. What the German soldiers who fought against them discovered was not an abstract American character, but something more universal, that under enough pressure, with leadership they trusted and a cause they half understood but refused to abandon, these men could be as stubborn and unyielding as anyone in gray. Bastogne did not decide the war by itself. The Reich was already bleeding in the east and from the air. Industrial weight, oil, and numbers were moving in one direction, but the siege gave those statistics a human contour. It showed that victory would not simply be a matter of material superiority crushing a better trained foe, it would also depend on who could keep going when cut off, freezing, and afraid. In later decades, films, books, and television would turn Bastogne into legend, sometimes smoothing its rough edges, sometimes amplifying its heroism. Yet beneath the layers of memory, the essential lesson remains stark. Underestimation is a dangerous comfort. In December 1944, German soldiers marched west convinced their enemy would fold. Instead, they found a circle of cold, hungry Americans who did not. The ruins were rebuilt. The snow melted, new generations grew up on quiet streets. But in the history of a war defined by machines and mass, the stand at Bastogne endures as a reminder that, in the end, wars are still decided by the endurance of human beings holding a line no one expected them to hold.